There's a coat hanging on a nail in my barn that I couldn't burn, couldn't bury, and couldn't bring myself to touch for 2 whole years. Wool gone thin at the elbows. A tear along the shoulder seemed that my wife swore she'd fix come spring, except spring came and she didn't. I'm a man who writes everything down, who owes me. What I owe, every dollar and every favor, all of it in a leather ledger I keep by the lamp. But grief doesn't fit in a ledger. There's no column for it. So the coat just hung there, a debt I couldn't pay and couldn't cancel. And then one October evening, half frozen and bleeding, a woman I'd never met walked out of the tree line carrying more sorrow than a body should be able to lift. And she looked at that coat like she understood exactly what it was. This is the story of a torn thing, and 2 people who didn't know how to be mended, and a promise I made before I understood what it would cost me. Stay with me. I'll tell it the way it happened, even the parts I'm ashamed of. The dog started barking before I heard anything, which was how I knew it was trouble and not the wind. Old Rufus didn't waste his voice. Coyotes, he'd growl it low, deep in his chest, but this was the sharp, up-and-down bark he saved for people, and there weren't supposed to be any people. Not out here. Not in October, with the first hard frost already whitening the fence posts and the sun dropping fast behind Coldwater Ridge. I was at the table with my ledger open, adding up what the cattle sale hadn't covered, which was most of everything, and I remember I didn't want to get up. I remember thinking, whatever it is, it can wait till I finish this column. That's a thing I've learned about myself. When the world's about to change, I always want one more quiet minute first. I got up anyway. Took the rifle down off the pegs, not because I'm quick to it, but because a man alone on 40 acres learns to answer his door with iron in his hand. Pushed the plank door open into a cold that grabbed my throat. Rufus was standing stiff-legged at the edge of the yard, hackles up, barking at the black wall of pines where my land ran out and the government's began. Rufus, quiet. He didn't quiet. He looked back at me once. I swear the animal had a whole sentence in that look. And then whined, which he never did, and that whine turned me cold in a way the frost hadn't managed. I walked out past the well. My breath came in clouds, and at the tree line, half in and half out of the dark, something moved that wasn't an animal. She came into the last of the light slow, one hand braced against a pine trunk like the tree was the only thing holding her up, and maybe it was. A woman. Apache I could see even from 30 feet, the cut of her dress, the way her hair was tied, the deerskin at her feet worn down to nothing. She had a bundle held tight against her chest with the arm that wasn't holding the tree, and she was shaking so hard I could see it from where I stood. Blood on her sleeve, blood dried dark down one side of her face from a cut above the eyebrow. I raised the rifle without deciding to. 2 years alone teaches your hands to do things your heart hasn't voted on yet. She saw it, she didn't run, she didn't beg. She just looked at me, looked at the rifle, then looked at my face, and her chin came up, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It was worse than fear. It was the flat, worn-out look of someone who has already lost the things that make a person afraid to die. I've seen that look once before, in a mirror, 2 years ago, the morning after the fever took Nora. I put the rifle down. "Ma'am," I said, which was a fool thing to say, and I knew it the second it left my mouth. She didn't speak English. Or maybe she did and just had no use for my manners. Either way, she swayed, and the tree stopped being enough, and she went down onto her knees in the frost, still clutching that bundle like it was the last warm thing in the world. I crossed the yard at a run. Up close she was younger than I'd thought, not a girl, but not far past it, maybe 5 and 20. The cut on her head had bled a lot the way head cuts do. Her lips had gone gray at the edges. And when I reached for her, she flinched so hard she near fell over, so I stopped, held my hands up, palms out, the way you'd gentle a spooked mare. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, slow. "Easy now, easy." She didn't understand the words. But something in the tone reached her, or maybe she was just too far gone to fight, because when I reached again, she let me take her weight. She was light as a bundle of kindling, cold as the ground. And that bundle against her chest I'd thought maybe food, maybe everything she owned rolled in a blanket. It moved. I near dropped her. It moved, and it made a small, thin sound, and I understood all at once what she'd been carrying through the mountains, bleeding and freezing and refusing to lie down. A baby, not more than a few months old. Wrapped in what was left of a wool blanket, its little face screwed up and red, alive, barely. And quiet in the terrible way babies go quiet when they've cried themselves past crying. I don't remember getting them into the house. I remember the fire, because I built it up so high and so fast I about set the chimney alight. I remember laying her by the hearth on Nora's old quilt and her not letting go of that child even half conscious, so that I had to warm them both together, and I remember my hands shaking worse than hers while I got water on to heat. And I remember, God help me, the thought that crossed my mind while I knelt there. I don't know how to keep anyone alive. I already proved that. I'll tell you the truth about myself so you understand the rest. When Nora took sick, I rode 4 hours to town for the doctor and 4 hours back, and he came and he did what he could, and it wasn't enough. And I have spent every day since certain that if I'd been faster, smarter, better, she'd have lived. There's no ledger entry for that either. I owe a debt to a dead woman that no amount of anything will ever pay down. And now here were 2 more lives set down in front of my fire, depending on a man who'd already failed the only person who ever mattered to him. The baby needed feeding. That much even I knew. I had no milk. I had a nanny goat out in the shed that I kept mostly out of habit, and I went out into the full dark and the cold, and I milked her by lantern light with my fingers gone clumsy, talking to her low the whole time. Come on, girl, come on now. And I brought the milk in warm, and we got a little into the child off the corner of a clean rag, drop by drop, the mother's cracked hands guiding mine. She watched me the whole time. Weak as she was, she watched every single thing I did with those flat, exhausted eyes, and I understood that she was measuring me, deciding whether I was the kind of man who'd help a woman and a baby to a warm death or the kind who'd help them live. I didn't blame her. There'd been men in these hills who did both wearing the same face. When the baby had taken what it would and gone slack and sleeping against her, some of the terrible tightness went out of her shoulders. She looked at me. She touched her own chest and said a word I didn't know. Said it again, patient like teaching. Dolly, I said back, trying it. It wasn't right. She almost smiled, the ghost of it, gone fast, and shook her head and said it slower. Dolly, something like that. A name I understood. Hers or the child's, I couldn't tell. Elia's, I said, and touched my own chest. Elia's crane. She looked at me a long moment. Then she looked past me, into the room, taking in the poverty of it. The one chair, the empty pegs where a second coat should hang. The general air of a house where a man has stopped trying to make it nice because there's nobody left to make it nice for. Her eyes stopped on the nail by the door. On Nora's coat. I'd forgotten it was even there, the way you forget a scar until someone looks at it. Brown wool, worn thin, that tear along the shoulder that Nora never fixed. Dolly, I'll call her Dolly, though I learned later it was the baby's name and hers was longer, and I never did earn the right to say it easy. Dolly looked at that coat, and something moved across her face that I recognized, because it was the thing that lived in my own chest. She knew a dead person's coat when she saw one. She didn't ask, couldn't have without the words, but her eyes came back to mine and held, and it was the first time she'd looked at me like I was a person and not a threat to be measured, and I found I couldn't hold it. I got up, made a show of tending the fire that didn't need tending. That's the kind of coward grief makes of a man. 2 years, and I still couldn't look straight at a stranger looking at my wife's coat. She slept then, finally, her and the child, tangled together on the quilt in the firelight, and I sat up in the chair with the rifle across my knees. Not against them, you understand, but against whatever it was out there in the dark that had put a cut on her head and blood on her sleeve and driven her through frozen mountains alone with a baby. Because that was the other thing I hadn't let myself think about yet. Someone had done this to her, and whoever it was, they might not be finished. I got my answer near dawn. Rufus started up again, that same sharp warning bark, and I was on my feet with my heart going before I was properly awake. Gray light in the windows, the fire down to coals. Dolly was awake too, sitting up fast, one arm curved over the sleeping baby, and the look on her face told me everything. She knew that sound. She'd been running from that sound. I went to the window. 3 riders coming up the wagon track from the flats. Slow, in no hurry, the way men ride when they think they're the most dangerous thing in the county. White men. One of them had a coil of rope on his saddle horn and a rifle across the pommel. The other 2 wore the look of men who did whatever the first one paid them to do. I knew the lead rider. Everyone in the valley knew Cabot Reese. He ran 3,000 head on the grass north of the ridge, and he ran it like a king runs a country, which is to say he took what he wanted and called it his by right of wanting it. There'd been Apache families on some of that north grass once. Government said they could stay. Reese had a different opinion, and Reese's opinion generally won because Reese had money and men, and the sheriff was a practical fellow. I looked back at Dolly, at the cut on her head, at the baby, at Nora's coat on the nail. And I understood, with the cold, clear certainty of a man reading a total at the bottom of a column, exactly what was riding up my track and exactly what I was about to have to decide. I could open the door and hand her over. Nobody would blame me. She wasn't mine. Her trouble wasn't mine. I had 40 acres and a mortgage and a rifle and a debt to a dead wife, and I did not have one single thing to spare, not food, not money, not the strength it takes to stand between a man like Cabot Reese and the thing he'd decided he wanted. Dolly was watching me. She couldn't understand a word I'd say, but she understood the door and the men and the way my hand was tightening on the rifle, and she understood better than I did, maybe, that whatever happened next, I was the one deciding it. She didn't beg. She'd never once begged, this woman, not when I raised a rifle at her, not when she fell down bleeding in my yard. She just held her child and looked at me with those flat, brave eyes and waited to learn what kind of man I was. And I thought about Nora. Not the way I usually thought about her, the guilt, the 4 hours there and 4 hours back. I thought about a thing she said once early on before the ranch broke us down to bone. She said, "Elias, you keep that ledger like the whole world's a debt, but some things you just give. You don't write them down, you just give them, and you don't ever expect to get paid back, and that's the only part of being alive that's worth a damn." I hadn't understood her then. I was a young man who thought a squared account was the same thing as a life well lived. I set the rifle against the wall. I went to the nail by the door and I took down Nora's coat, the first time I'd touched it in 2 years, and it was lighter than I remembered, and it still faintly, impossibly smelled like her, and I crossed the room and I laid it over Dolly's shoulders. She startled, looked up at me. I don't know what my face was doing. I couldn't feel it. "You keep out of sight," I said, though she couldn't understand. "You and the little one in the back room, and you keep quiet." I pointed. She understood the pointing. She got up unsteady, the coat swallowing her small frame, and she stopped in front of me on her way past. Close. And she reached up one cracked and blistered hand and laid it flat against my chest, right over the place where all my debts and all my grief lived, and she said something soft I didn't know the words to. But I knew what it meant. Then she was gone into the back room, and the men were in my yard, and Cabot Reese was calling out in that easy-carrying voice of his, "Crane, Elias Crane, come on out. We got a little matter to discuss." I picked the rifle back up, and I opened my door to the morning, and to the 3 men who'd come to take her, with no plan in my head and no idea in the world how I was going to keep the promise I'd just made without saying a single word out loud. Cabot Reese didn't get down off his horse. Men like him never do, not right away. Getting down is a thing you do for an equal, and Reese hadn't ridden onto my land expecting to meet one. "Elias," he tipped his hat back with one gloved finger, friendly as a preacher on collection day. "Cold morning for standing in a doorway." "Colder for riding," I said. "What do you want, Cabot?" Behind him, his 2 men had fanned out a little, easy, the way dogs spread when they've done a thing before and know their places. The one with the rope let it hang loose off his horn. The other kept his hand near his rifle, but not on it. Not a threat yet. A promise of one. Reese looked past me at the house. At the smoke coming off my chimney, thick, more smoke than one man alone burns to keep himself warm, I watched him notice it. I watched him file it away. "Squaw come through here in the night," he said, conversational. "Hers is a whole sad business, Elias, and I'll spare you the parts that turn your stomach. Point is she took something belongs to me, and she's got a young'un that well. That's a matter for folks better than us to sort out. Government folks, Christian folks, you understand. So if you happen to see a woman, Apache woman, come limping through here." "I didn't see anybody," I said. The lie came out clean and flat, and it surprised me how clean, because I am not by nature a good liar. I keep a ledger for the exact reason that I want the accounts of my life to come out even and true. But I said it without a hitch, and I understood in the saying that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and that whatever this cost me, it was already spent. Reese studied me. He had pale eyes, the kind of gray that doesn't warm up even when the mouth around it smiles. "That's a lot of smoke," he said, "for a man's got nobody to keep warm." "Wife's coat's finally too thin," I said. "Been burning more wood since the cold came. Fire's the only company I keep." I don't know where that came from. It was true and it was a lie both at once. The coat was thin, and it was warming a woman not my wife in a back room not 20 feet from where Reese sat his horse, and something about saying it near broke me right there in the doorway. But it landed. Reese's mouth twisted in what he probably thought was sympathy. Everyone in the valley knew about Nora. A widowed man burning wood alone was the most ordinary sad thing in the world, and it explained the smoke, and it was the kind of story a man like Reese believed because it cost him nothing to believe it. Well, he said, he gathered his reins. You see her, you don't try to be a hero, you hear? Woman like that's dangerous. Killed a man 2 nights back, that's God's truth, Elias. Put a knife in one of my hands over some misunderstanding about that baby. She's not what she looks like. You send word to my place, there's money in it. $20 gold. $20 gold. More than the cattle sale had cleared. Enough to make the mortgage payment I was short on. He watched my face when he said it because he knew what $20 meant to a man in my shape. And he was right to watch. Because, God forgive me, there was 1/2 of 1 second where the number did its work on me. Then I thought of her hand flat against my chest. That soft word I didn't know. I'll keep an eye out, I said. Reese held my eyes a beat too long. Then he nodded and turned his horse, and his 2 men turned with him, and I stood in the doorway and watched the 3 of them ride back down my track the way they'd come, slow, in no hurry, and I did not go inside until they were small and gone against the gray hills. Then my legs went, and I sat down hard on the cold step, and I shook for a while like a man with the fever. Inside, Dolly was standing in the door of the back room with the baby against her, and a kitchen knife I hadn't known she'd taken held down low against her thigh. She'd have used it, I understood that clear. Not on me, on herself, on them, on whoever came through that door meaning to take the child. She'd have done the last terrible thing before she let it happen, and she'd worked out already that I might be the one to make it necessary, and she'd stood there in the dark the whole time listening to me lie for her not knowing if the lie was for her or against her. When I came in and shut the door and she saw it was only me and saw my face, she set the knife down on the table. Slow, she didn't say anything. Neither did I. There wasn't a language between us that had words for what had just happened in that yard. She reached up and touched the collar of Nora's coat, still around her shoulders, looked at me, and I saw her understand what it had cost me to hand it over, and what it meant that I'd told a man it was too thin to warm a wife who was 2 years dead. She took it off, held it out to me. I shook my head and pushed it gently back toward her. You're cold, I said. Keep it. She wouldn't. She was stubborn as the hills, this woman. I was learning that fast. She pressed the coat into my hands and turned my own fingers over the tear in the shoulder seam, that same tear Nora never got to, and she looked at me and made a small motion, a needle, drawn through cloth, in and out. Then she pointed at herself. She was telling me she would fix it. I don't know why that undid me the way it did. A torn coat. A stranger offering to sew up a torn coat with her cut hands in a cold house at the end of the worst night of her life. But I had carried that tear around for 2 years like it was a wound in my own skin, unable to mend it because mending it meant admitting Nora wasn't coming back to do it herself. And here was this woman I'd met the evening before offering to close the thing I'd left open out of grief and cowardice both. I said, you don't have to. And she said something back, low and steady, and though I didn't know the words, I understood the shape of them, because grief has the same shape in every language. She was saying, let me. I need to fix something. Let it be this. So I let her. That was the first day. She stayed because she had nowhere on this earth to go, and because winter was coming down off the ridge, and because a woman running with a baby and 3 men behind her doesn't turn down a roof. I let her stay because I've turned this over 1,000 times, and I'll give you the truest answer I've got. Because for 2 years, my house had been a place where a man came to be alone with his failures. And for the first time since Nora, it had somebody living in it who needed keeping alive. And it turned out I'd been starving for that without knowing the name of the hunger. We built a language out of nothing, out of pointing and drawing in the ashes and the goat's milk and the fire. I learned that the baby's name was Dolly, and I'd been calling the mother by her daughter's name for a full day. When I finally understood, she laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, like it got out before she could stop it. And it was the best sound I'd heard in that house in longer than I could measure. Her own name I'll keep. She told it to me the 3rd night, slow and careful, and it's mine to keep. One of the few things in my life I never wrote in any ledger. She mended the coat that first week. Sat by the fire in the evenings with Nora's needle and Nora's thread from the sewing box I'd never been able to open, and she drew that tear close stitch by stitch, and her hands, cut and blistered from the mountains, steadied as they worked, the way a person's hands will steady when they've finally got something to do that means something. I sat across the fire pretending to add up my accounts and watching her, and I thought about the thing Reese had said. She killed a man, put a knife in one of my hands. I made myself ask her about it. God knows how, pointing at the knife on the table at her, at the cut on her head, a whole clumsy pantomime. And she went still. And then she told me, in her way, the whole of it. And though I didn't have the words, I had the pictures, and the pictures were these. A camp on the North Grass, where the government said her people could stay. Reese's men who had a different opinion. A husband, she touched her wedding finger, then made a sign I understood to mean gone, ended, dead. And a man of Reese's who'd wanted more than the land, who'd come for her in the dark, and the knife she'd used, and the running she'd done after with the baby against her chest, because a woman who kills one of Cabot Reese's men does not stay alive on Cabot Reese's grass, whatever the government says. She hadn't taken anything of Reese's. There was nothing of Reese's to take. The only thing she carried out of that camp was her daughter and her own life, and Reese wanted them back not because they were his, but because a man like that cannot abide a thing that got away from him. When she finished the telling, she looked at me steady, waiting again to learn what kind of man I was, whether knowing the truth would make me put her out. It's a terrible thing, to watch a person brace for you to fail them. I've done my share of failing, but I looked at that woman who'd done the last hard thing to keep her child, and I thought there was more courage sitting at my fire than I'd managed in 2 years of grieving, and I reached across, and I laid my hand over hers on the mended coat. "You're safe here," I said, "as long as I've got breath in me. You're safe here." She couldn't understand the words. She understood the words. The weeks turned. The frost came down hard and the ridge went white, and Reese's riders passed my place twice more, slow, watching the smoke, and both times Dolly went silent into the back room with the knife, and both times I stood in my door and lied, and both times they rode on. But I could feel it building, the way you feel whether building, a pressure, a wrongness in the air. Reese hadn't given up. Men like him don't. He was only waiting to be sure. And there was the other thing, the thing I'm ashamed to tell but promised I would. I was falling in love with her. Not fast, not the way a young fool falls. Slow, the way an old tree leans into the light over years without ever meaning to. In the evenings, in the small sounds of a house that had a woman and a child in it again. In the way little Dolly learned to reach for me and grab my rough finger in her whole tiny fist. In her mother's laugh, which I heard more often now, and her hands mending not just the coat but the frayed cuffs of my shirts and the split seam of the grain sack and every torn thing in my house, as if she meant to stitch the whole broken place back together while she was in it. And every night I lay awake ashamed, because Nora had been dead 2 years and here I was warming to a stranger, and because a man doesn't get to love a second time when he couldn't even save the first, and because this was the coward's fear, and I knew it even then, because loving Dolly meant I could lose her, and I did not think I would survive losing again. There's no column in a ledger for that either. It was the night the first real snow came that it happened. I woke to the baby crying, not her hungry cry, which I'd learned, but a high scared cry, and to Dolly's voice sharp and low, and to Rufus outside not barking but making a sound I'd never heard him make, a low broken whimper cut off sudden and complete. Cut off. I was out of the bed and had the rifle before I was awake. The fire was down to red eyes in the dark. Dolly stood in the middle of the room with the baby clutched to her and the knife in her hand and her face turned toward the door, and through the gaps in the shutters I could see it light out in the snow. Torchlight, more than one. Reese hadn't sent his riders this time. Reese had come himself in the dark in the snow, with enough men to be sure, on the one night I hadn't been watching. And Rufus, who never wasted his voice, had given his last warning and gone quiet, and I understood what the quiet meant, and something in my chest that had been broken for 2 years and had only just started to knit came apart all over again. Dolly looked at me across the dark room, the baby screaming, the torchlight growing at the window. And she didn't beg, she never once begged, but she held out the knife to me handle first, and I understood what she was asking, and it was the heaviest thing anyone has ever asked me. She was asking me to promise her the mercy if it came to that, before they could take the child. And Cabot Reese's voice came out of the snow, and the dark, easy and carrying, not friendly anymore. "Crane," he said, "you lying son of a bitch, send her out." I did not take the knife. I want that written down plain, because it's the one thing from that night I'm not ashamed of. Dolly held it out to me handle first, asking me to promise the last mercy, and every part of me that had learned to expect the worst reached to take it. But my hand stopped. And I looked at her, and at little Dolly screaming against her chest, and at the torchlight climbing the walls, and I understood that taking that knife meant I'd already given up, that I'd already counted the column and found it couldn't come out even. Nora's voice from years back, some things you just give, you don't ever expect to get paid back. I pushed the knife gently down. No, I said, not tonight, not while I'm breathing. Then I went to the window, and I put the muzzle of my rifle through the gap in the shutter, and I fired it once into the sky. The crack of it rolled off the ridge and came back doubled. Out in the yard a horse screamed and shied, and I heard a man swear, and I heard Reese's voice snap them back to order, and I used those few seconds to think faster than I've ever thought in my life. 4 men, I'd counted 4 sets of torchlight, Reese and 3, against one widowed rancher with a single-shot rifle and 11 cartridges and a woman who couldn't afford to be seen fighting because the fighting was the whole reason they'd come. The arithmetic was ugly. I've never been a brave man, I told you that at the start, and I meant it. I'm a man who wanted one more quiet minute before the world changed. But there's a thing that happens when you stop trying to make the numbers come out even and just decide what you're willing to spend. I'd spent 2 years not saving Nora. I was not going to spend one more night not saving them. Crane, Reese again, closer and angry now, the friendliness burned off him. You think I don't know? I know. I got a man says he saw the coat move in your window 3 weeks back. I gave you every chance to be smart. Send the squaw out and the baby with her and I'll ride off and forget you lied to my face. You don't and I burn you out and I let my boys sort what's left. Your choice, widower, you got till I count 10. He started counting. Dolly was at my shoulder. She'd set the baby in the wood box, wrapped tight, the safest hard place in the room, and she'd taken up the knife herself, not to give up this time, but to stand. She looked at me and I looked at her, and there wasn't a word between us in any language, but we agreed on something in that look, and it was this, not the child. Whatever else, not the child. Reese reached for. I did the thing that saved us, and I'll tell you honest, it wasn't courage. It was the ledger. It was 2 years of adding columns by lamplight, of knowing to the penny what every man in the valley owed and was owed. Because I knew something about Cabot Reese's 3 men that Reese, sitting up on his throne of 3,000 head, had never bothered to learn. I knew who they were. Tom Alvey, I shouted into the snow. That you out there, Tom, it's Elias Crane. I carried your daddy's coffin, Tom, 3 winters back when the pox took him and Reese wouldn't spare a wagon to bring him to town. You remember who dug that grave? It was me, in the frozen ground, because your boss couldn't be troubled. Silence in the yard, the counting had stopped. And who's the other with you? That's Sam Pryor. Sam, your wife's people are Cherokee, everybody knows it, you married in over in the nations. You going to burn a woman and a baby out into the snow tonight, Sam? Because a rich man told you to? You look at that baby when they drag it out and you tell me it's different from yours. I don't know where the words came from. I'm not a talker. But I'd spent 2 years alone with nothing but accounts and grief, and it turned out that under all of it I'd been keeping a different kind of ledger without knowing. A record of every small cruelty Reese had done, and every small debt of decency the valley owed itself, and it all came pouring out of me through a gap in a shutter with a rifle shaking in my hands. He'll pay you $30 maybe, I called. Split 3 ways, to do a thing you'll carry the rest of your lives. I'm offering you nothing but the chance to ride home and still be men your children can look at. That's a poorer wage, I know it, but you know which one you'll sleep on. Then I stopped, because there was nothing left to say and everything left to happen, and it was out of my hands. The snow came down soft in the torchlight. Somewhere the baby had gone quiet, and in the long, terrible stretch of that quiet I heard Cabot Reese say, low and dangerous, "Don't you listen to that broke-down widower. Alvey, torch it." And I heard Tom Alvey say, young voice, cracking on it, "No, sir, I don't reckon I will." The rope hit the snow. I heard it, that soft, heavy sound, then a second one. "You're fired," Reese said. "Both of you, every man here, you'll starve. I'll see you never." "Then we'll starve," said the one I'd guessed was Sam Pryor, and his voice was tired like a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "Come on, Tom, I don't want to be here for what he does next." 2 horses turning, walking off into the snow. And then the third man's following, because a man alone in the dark reconsiders his loyalties fast when the other men have already gone. And then it was just Cabot Reese in my yard, on his horse, in the falling snow, with a torch guttering in his fist, and the whole machinery of his power dismantled around him in the space of a minute by a coward with a ledger. I've thought a long time about what happened next, and I still don't have it squared. Reese could have ridden off. A smart man would have. His men were gone, the odds had flipped, and there'd be other nights, other ways. Men like Reese always find other ways. But I'd done a thing worse than beat him. I'd shamed him in front of his own hired men, and shame in a man like that doesn't cool. It catches. He kicked his horse and came at the house with the torch. I fired. I'm not going to dress it up. I aimed for the torch arm, and I was shaking, and the light was bad, and the shot took him high in the chest, and he went off the back of the horse into the snow, and the torch went with him and hissed out in the wet. And then it was dark and quiet, and there was a man dying in my yard that I had put there. I went out to him. I don't know why. I knelt down in the snow in my nightshirt with the cold coming up through my knees, and Cabot Reese looked up at me with those pale eyes gone paler, and he said something. I thought it'd be a curse, but it wasn't. It was almost wondering, he said. Over a squaw. You die over a squaw. Like the arithmetic of it made no sense to him even at the end. Like a man will die and still not understand the one thing that would have saved him. No, I said, over a person. He didn't answer that. There wasn't time. And I knelt there and held the hand of the man I'd killed until his hand stopped holding back, because whatever he'd been, no one should die alone in the snow, and because I'd learned something in 2 years of grief about how much it matters, at the end, whether someone's there. Dolly found me still kneeling there. She came out barefoot into the snow with the coat, Nora's coat, mended, the tear closed clean, and she put it over my shoulders, and she didn't try to pull me away or say it was done or any of the things people say. She just knelt down beside me in the cold, the two of us over the body of the man who'd come to burn us, and she stayed until I could stand. That was the worst night, but it wasn't the ending. The sheriff came, of course. Reese was a rich man, and rich men's deaths get looked at. But Tom Alvey and Sam Pryor came too, and they told it true, the camp, the husband. The man Dolly'd knifed defending herself and her child, the torches, the count to 10. Turned out a killed rancher's a different matter when his own men will swear he rode out in the night to burn a woman and a baby, and a widower stood in his door and told him no. The valley, it turned out, had its own ledger on Cabot Reese, and when the chance came to settle it, more folks than I'd have guessed stood up on the right side of the column. They let it be self-defense, which it was, which it also wasn't, and I carry that, and I always will. Dolly stayed. Not because she had nowhere to go. The government men came, eventually, and there was talk of settling her people back on the north grass now that the man who'd driven them off was in the ground, and she could have gone. She stayed because she chose to, and I asked her to, and by then we'd built enough language between us to ask and answer a thing like that plain. I'll tell you how I asked, because it's the only proposal I've got, and I'm not ashamed of it. I took down the coat. Nora's coat that Dolly had mended with her own cut hands that first terrible week. And I held it out to her, and I pointed at the tear that wasn't there anymore, closed clean and strong, better than Nora had ever gotten to. And I put my hand over my own chest, over the place where all my debts and all my grief had lived for 2 years, the place her hand had touched that first night. And I made the sign she'd made me, needle drawn through cloth, in and out, and I pointed from the coat to my chest. You mended that, mend this. She understood. She'd always understood. She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier, I'll say it now, my wife. She looked at me a long moment with those steady eyes that had measured me over a rifle barrel the first night and found me wanting and stayed anyway until I grew into something better. And then she took the coat, and she folded it, and she set it not on the nail by the door but in the cedar chest where a thing is kept that you mean to keep forever. And she came and stood in front of me, and she put her hand flat over my chest. And she said, in English, the first full sentence of English I ever heard her speak, that she'd been learning in secret all those weeks, drop by drop the way we'd fed her daughter goat's milk off a rag. She said, I stay. Little Dolly calls me father now. She won't remember the snow or the torches or the man in the yard or the mountains her mother carried her through bleeding. She'll only ever know this house with the fire lit and the goat in the shed and the ledger by the lamp, except I don't keep the ledger the way I used to. I still write down the debts. But I've started a second column now, one Nora would have laughed at me for taking so long to learn. The things you give and never expect back. It's the longer column. It gets longer every day. There's a coat in the cedar chest that got mended by a woman who couldn't afford to mend anything, on the worst night of her life, for a man who'd done nothing to earn it. And there's a heart in my chest that got mended the same way. I don't know how to write down what I owe for that. I've stopped trying,